so he couldn't see who was sitting in the passenger seat, but it felt like the person's interest centered on Ivan. Maybe his imagination was working overtime, but he'd swear he felt the weight of the person's stare. Nick's lips moved, but Ivan couldn't hear what he said until he barked out something that sounded like, "Rory!" Ivan reached the edge of the gathering under the tent and turned his full attention to the sedan. The passenger door swung open, and a man of medium height stepped out of the vehicle. He had dark hair, a trimmed beard, tan skin, and light eyes zeroed in on Ivan. So it hadn't been his imagination. The stranger, Rory, perhaps, curved his lips into a sly smile as they continued to stare at one another. Ivan hadn't fabricated the man's interest before, and there was no mistaking it now. Something responded deep in his belly, an ignored urge unfurling and awakening. The stranger was stunning, and he fucking knew it. 5 months had passed since the last time Ivan had used his Grindr app, and it was starting to take a toll on his body. Thankfully, he had business meetings in Denver in a week, and he'd get ample opportunity to find a hookup. He imagined spotting someone like this guy at a bar or nightclub and walking over to introduce himself. Ivan could buy him a drink, lead him to a dark corner, and tell the sexy stranger what he wanted to do with his pretty mouth, among other things. They could leave together without finishing their drinks and head someplace close. Ivan would keep every dirty promise he'd made in the dark. And if it was as good as Ivan pictured in his brain, they would start from the top and do it all over again at least one more time before parting ways. But that side of Ivan only existed in his fantasies. He would find a horny guy looking for a hookup on the app, bend him over, and fuck out his frustration until they were both spent. Then he'd dress and leave. The encounter wouldn't vanquish Ivan's loneliness, but it would smooth the edges until the ache became too great to ignore once again. Kind of like the need now pulsing below his belt and gathering steam the longer he stared at the beautiful stranger who'd just arrived at the ranch. "Look away, idiot. This isn't a bar and your crew is watching." The reminder should have been enough to make Ivan look away, but he continued staring into mesmerizing blue eyes that enticed him to be the brave man in his fantasies. A quick glance at Agent Scott revealed a man who looked on the edge of losing his cool with his sidekick. The entire situation was puzzling. "Who the hell is that?" Ivan thought he'd asked in his head, until Dylan, his best friend and the ranch's canine trainer, chuckled and slapped him on the shoulder. Ivan had been too entranced by the dark-haired stranger and the evocative fantasy he'd imagined to even notice Dylan had moved to stand beside him. When Ivan stepped out of the barn, his buddy was flipping something on the grill while chatting with Harry, the ranch's domestic goddess, Finley's older sister, and the object of Dylan's desire. "I was about to ask you the same thing," Dylan said, giving Ivan exaggerated once-over. "I hardly recognize you." He lifted his hand and messed up Ivan's freshly styled hair. "You said you were getting a haircut at lunch. You said nothing about going for a new look. The fade looks nice and tight, and so does your chin bush. I like it." Ivan stepped away and used his fingers to fix the strands Dylan messed up. He resisted running his hands over his shorter beard. He'd asked Danielle to tidy it, but she'd shorn a few inches off the length. Ivan's sideburns and cheek lines looked sharp enough to cut glass. He'd asked her to shake things up and had given her free rein, and he'd loved the results. Ivan had left the barbershop feeling great about himself, but Dylan's comments made him feel self-conscious and maybe a little foolish. Who had he been trying to impress? "Then stop finger-fucking it," he groused. "Let me have nice hair for a few hours." There was no way in hell he'd ever get it to look this good again. "Danielle used a round brush and a blow-dryer to style the swoop on the top. I can't replicate that." Dylan rolled his eyes. "Can't really isn't a word in your vocabulary. I just..."